What's up, guys? I wanted to create a video and talk about royal marriages. Why families arranged the marriages they did, why they inbred, and specifically whether or not inbreeding was a smart thing to do. So I'm looking at the family tree here for the House of Habsburg, and they were the dynasty I wanted to talk about because they were the family most known for inbreeding. What they would do is they would take a daughter of their family, generally the eldest daughter, and they would find a loose cousin or uncle or nephew somewhere, and they would marry her to him. Gross, right? Well, maybe not. So why did they do this? Well, it has to do with the inheritance law which existed in Europe at the time. How things were passed down was based on primogeniture. Primogeniture means to the firstborn, or the firstborn gets everything. Sons had priority. So if you had a daughter and she was 14 and your son was 12, because he was male, he would be your heir, not your daughter. However, if you had no sons, your daughter would be your heir. If you know anything about the contemporary United Kingdom, they recently changed this so they have absolute primogeniture now, which means that the oldest child of whatever gender becomes the heir. So they don't prioritize sons anymore. Anyway, for most of history, though, royal families were terrified of having daughters. Why? If you know the story of Henry VIII, he was obsessed with giving birth to a son, but he kept having daughters. So why is this? The reason is because if your daughter married, the children she had would belong to her husband's family. So they would take the name of her husband and not her. So in other words, if your daughter was your heir and you left all your things to her, then in the words of Tywin Lannister, your legacy was going to come to an end. Your family name was going to come to an end. All the work of you and your ancestors, all the effort to build your house was going to come to an end. Everything was going to go to your son-in-law and, by extension, his family. So you wanted to avoid this happening whenever possible. So getting back to our Habsburgs here, they had a very interesting situation because they had two branches of their family which ran different places in Europe. You had these two brothers, Charles and Ferdinand, and each started a different branch of the family. The descendants of Charles V, so basically all the Phils here, Philip, and Philip were the rulers of Spain, and the descendants of Ferdinand, first his eldest son, and then all these guys were the rulers of today, what would be Central Europe. So this created an interesting dynamic. They always had a parallel line of the family who they could marry with and make sure they were keeping things inside the dynasty with. So let's look at what they did. We have Charles and Isabella. They have a son, they have a daughter. Just in case Philip dies, for insurance, they want to make sure their family doesn't lose Spain. So they take their daughter Maria and they marry her to her cousin. Ferdinand's eldest son, he inherits the lands of his father. He gives birth to a bunch of sons who I didn't put on this family tree. But he also takes his eldest daughter Anne and marries her back into the other side of the family for insurance. So this would be her uncle. This is Philip II. And this intermarriage repeats. Philip III marries his second cousin. Then of their children, Maria Anna marries her cousin, and Philip IV ends up marrying his niece. So all of this is done theoretically for insurance, to keep things from going outside of the family. Meanwhile, we see that whenever they have an extra son, they use him to marry outside of the family. And the purpose of this is sort of the opposite of the daughter strategy. In this case, their goal is to marry the female heirs of another family to see if they can add more lands to their family through that way. So we see these two marriages to Maria Anna and another Maria Anna are attempts to marry outside of the family. Just to give you an example and show how well this all worked, Charles V inherited Spain as a result of his father's marriage. Philip II inherited Portugal as a result of his father's marriage. Ferdinand's marriage got his son a large share of Central Europe. So you see that this is how they brought new lands into the family, and they did it peacefully. There's actually a famous motto of the Habsburgs, which was, "Let others wage war, we will marry." And this summarized what their strategy was: to use marriage as a tool to become stronger. So if you want to think of it in this way, they used their daughters conservatively, or they married their daughters conservatively to keep what they already had, and they tried to marry their sons liberally to try to bring new lands into the family. So now that we've talked about the pros of this strategy, let's look at the negatives. Because even though what they're trying to be careful, nature is going to have a problem with what they're doing, and it's going to make them pay for it. They did inherit a few congenital traits which got worse with the inbreeding. The most famous was what was called the Habsburg jaw. And basically every member of the family had a large underbite, and it got worse as their inbreeding did. So you can see examples of this with Charles V and Philip IV, and most exaggeratedly with Charles II. And it got so bad that later members of the family were unable to chew their own food when they had to eat. Mental illness also entered the family through Joanna the Mad. Many members of the family had a tendency toward depression, and this only got worse through inbreeding. But let's look at the stress that's being put on the family by what they're doing. Obviously, the amounts of biological stress that's being put on the family by this point with Philip IV is intense. And something's going to happen here, because you can't inbreed this extensively and not create a problem. Did they know intermarriage caused problems? Yes and no. No, they didn't know about genetics like we know today. They based their ideas on the Bible. And in the Old Testament, the ban was on marrying your immediate relations. So they had a taboo about marrying your sister, but they didn't have a taboo about marrying your cousins or aunts or uncles. Anyway, we're finally getting to the bottom of our tree here, and the reason why inbreeding is not a good thing. So yes, it is insurance. Yes, it keeps things in the family. But if you do it too much and cause too much stress, you end up inevitably with Charles II. Charles was physically and intellectually disabled. He couldn't speak. He couldn't eat. He had epileptic seizures. When he got married and tried to reproduce, he was unable to. He was sterile. His jaw was actually so deformed, and he had such a huge underbite that he could not chew his own food. So he was the result of all this intermarriage, and not only did this cause immense harm to Spain, but when he died, because he couldn't reproduce, it caused a succession crisis, and that meant the end of the Habsburg family in Spain. So anyway, that's the final word. All this intermarriage worked to an extent, but eventually nature is going to have a problem, and if you keep doing it, force your family to come to an end. I hope this was an interesting discussion for you, and I'll see you guys again.